Extraordinary Phenomenon Investigations Council presents Epic Voyages. Come join us as we enter and experience the great mysteries of the world with tonight's host,
Alan B. Smith.
To you all, live from my favorite town, New York City. This is Epic Voyages Radio, broadcasting to the world and beyond on the Inception Radio Network. I am your host, Alan Smith, and tonight I welcome you to pull up a log and get comfy around this paranormal campfire that is Epic Voyages. And as we traverse this paranormal plane tonight, please follow us on Twitter and share your thoughts. The account is at Epic Voyagers. That's at capital EPIC Voyagers, hashtag Ted Peters. So prepare to open your head, as our guest tonight is Theologian Ted Peters, author of UFOs, God's Chariots. And he has come to shed some light on the alien encounter and its religious implications. But before we really dig into that, I wanted to recap a bit on the UFO scene for the year of 2014. According to an OpenMinds.tv article based on information from the Mutual UFO Network, New York ranked number 4 with 302 sightings, Florida number 3 with 456 sightings, Texas number 2 with 473, and California number 1 with 1,092 sightings reported. And now the numbers do differ a little bit from the National UFO Reporting Center run by Peter Davenport. But the overall number, according to Newfork, for the year looks like 8,479 reports this past year. And on average, the numbers seem to be going up. And I'm sharing this information with you tonight because these numbers are huge. And as we all know, the mainstream media doesn't report on these sightings as they should. And tonight, I guess I'm hoping to encourage you to take your email, social media, to another level and consistently and continuously send out requests to your local or national media stations to firmly encourage them to share these findings, which can be found on Newfork and MUFON. The information is out there, and they just need to get their heads out of the sand and face the facts. So that said, I would love to hear about any recent sightings that you've had this year, especially if you're in the New York area, as I'm a bit New York-centric. And you can share those stories in the chat room. Just click on chat in the menu bar of the Inception Radio Network website, or feel free to call in during open lines in the later part of the show to share your story. And that number is 888-919-2355. That's 888-919-BELL. And press option 1 to connect to the studio. And now I'd like to introduce someone who has turned the UFO and ET visitation enigma on its head. Really quick, a little bit about Ted. Ted Peters is an author, professor, and pastor. He is research professor emeritus in systematic theology and ethics at Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary, the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences, and the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. Ted has authored, co-authored, edited, and co-edited more than 24 books. The topics range from sin and evil to the future of God and to points where science and religion clash and cooperate. Ted offers a theological analysis of culture, analyzing especially the role of science in culture. He co-edits the journal Theology and Science. His books include God, For God and Country, Short Prayers, and the book which we'll be discussing tonight, UFOs, God's Chariots, ? Ted, welcome to the Epic Voyages.
Al, it's good to be on an epic voyage with you this evening.
Oh, yeah, man. Thanks. I really appreciate you coming on.
Well, 1,092 UFO sightings in California in 2014. I was hoping that I could be one of those, but you know what? They just flew right past my house without telling me they were near.
Did they? So you've never seen a UFO before?
Unfortunately, I have not, but being a UFO investigator, I've personally interviewed maybe 100 people in all different categories, fly-by-nights and daylight discs and close encounters of various kinds. So I have secondhand information, not first.
Okay, great. And so that makes you wonder, because most people who find themselves entrapped and intrigued in this topic, this phenomena, tend to have had an experience themselves. So what was it that started that for you? I remember in your book you mentioned Adam Adamski. Can you kind of talk about that a little bit?
Well, yes, it is interesting that you mention the experiencers, because I like to work a lot in the interaction between faith and natural science. And there are a lot of scientists, some even with PhDs, interested in UFOs. And if you ask them, they'll probably tell you they had a UFO experience, and that's why they're working on it. So that is important. That did not happen to me. When I was a young kid growing up, it was my mother and father who were very interested, and they brought home the books that were being written, and they actually went to hear George Adamski and some of the other speakers of the 1950s, and I would wait until they got home, and then I would listen to the entire debriefing and read the books and stuff like that. And so that's what I did as a kid. And in the 7th grade, I was the neighborhood expert on flying saucers. And then later on, when I became a teaching professor, I got re-interested, in part because of the rise of the ancient astronaut theorists. But I went back and reviewed all my newspaper and magazine clippings over a 40-year period, and have tried to piece that history together.
Yeah, as well, it's funny you say you listen to them around the table. I mean, for so many people, what they listen to around the table is politics when they're kids. They hear their parents talk about politics and sports and what have you. So this is a really interesting way to be raised.
It is. I actually hadn't thought about it that way, Alan, but maybe I was the beneficiary of curious parents.
Yeah, well, you got an early education. That's great.
All right. When I later joined MUFON and became an investigator, my dad, who was still living then, he would go with me to the MUFON meetings. He just loved it.
All right. So then this is your childhood, right? That were part of your childhood growing up.
Right.
And then as you got older, you started to look at this more seriously from a theological point of view. And now the book we're covering tonight, UFOs, God's Chariots, this is a second edition. The original came out in 1977, correct?
At the University of Chicago, back in the days of Mircea Eliade, who was a great scholar of the history of religions. And so I began to look at the UFO phenomenon. Even though it's a very secular phenomenon, to be sure, I was looking for the religious dimensions that might be embedded in this. One of my favorite University of Chicago professors was a guy named Langdon Gilkey, who specialized in religion and science, and he said, take a look at what's going on in the secular world, and you'll see that religion is alive and well. They just changed the names.
And
so that's kind of what I've done.
Yeah. Well, going through one of the quotes in your book, I thought this is a really, really great expression of where you're coming from. It said, quote, "The unfathomable depth, the incomprehensible infinity of the heavenly vault buried itself within my soul."
Yes, I like to think of outer space in my inner soul. I think that the sky for your and my ancestors was intrinsically religious for people. And then after we conquered the sky with science and technology, that is to say jet airplanes and weather reports on television, right behind that was a second sky. And so when the astronauts began heading towards the moon, they were having religious experiences again. Outer space, although it's the topic for the scientists, has a way of getting into our souls and eliciting a sense of infinity and magnificence and almost incomprehensibility. And so it's kind of a natural symbol of religious transcendence.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, when I was younger, I had a sighting myself, and I wouldn't say it was a religious experience by any means, but when you see something that just absolutely defies, explanation, it does alter the way you think. It is a sort of revelation.
Now, was yours a daylight disc or?
It was a nighttime sighting.
Or close encounter? Yeah.
Oh, no, just a sighting in the sky. But from that point on, I've not been able to let go of the subject, and so many other people feel the same way.
Well, I really understand that, because if it's associated with the sky or associated with space,
mm-hmm.
then it's kind of like an icon. You see through it to this great unfathomable reality that is out there. And I think that the question of extraterrestrial beings in general and flying saucers in particular, they have this religious resonance. You didn't call it religious because it's a secular experience, but
mm-hmm.
What I'm saying is that's that sense of what Rudolf Otto called the mysterium tremendum, a tremendous mystery that sort of sucks us up into it, so to speak, and we feel that we're brought up beyond ourselves. And oh yes, it could be material, physical, and all of that kind of thing, but it is attuned with what our ancient ancestors probably experienced when they too had some extravagant experiences that we now call religious.
You're right, and this is the meat of your book. This is the soul of what you're talking about. So if we can break it down a little bit, just to start off, you also said in the book that the enigma is, quote, like a greased pig. That's a pretty funny analogy. So what does that mean to you?
Well, I think there is a core to the UFO phenomenon from 1947 down till the present day.
Mm-hmm.
And that core is an attempt to provide a scientized or scientific explanation for these unusual phenomena, and the explanation includes a concept of planets in the universe like ours, with intelligent creatures like we are, and along with that, the theory of evolution, that these intelligent creatures are more highly evolved or advanced than we are. I call this the ETI myth, or the UFO myth.
Why do you call it the myth? What does that mean, myth?
Because, in this case, it's a structure of interpretation. It's a set of assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
By myth, I don't mean it's untrue. What I mean is it's a set of assumptions that cannot be proved.
Okay.
That we sort of project. Thank you, Alan, for making me be precise. It's my responsibility to be precise. And I think that that's sort of the backbone, but there are lots of ribs that spin off, such as we mentioned George Adamski and the UFO contactees of the 1950s, and actually with the Raelians, right down to the present time, where we end up with a political agenda and a religious agenda, etc. Or the conflation with New Age spirituality that began in the 60s and 70s with mystical relationships or telepathic relationships with extraterrestrial intelligence. And when I go to a UFO meeting, I find this kind of hardcore, scientifically oriented ufologists running around, but right along with it, find witches and people engaged in reincarnation therapy and all kinds of other things. And what they tell me is, well, they just like being with a group of people that don't give negative judgments because they've got these wild ideas. So, in part, I want to say the UFO phenomenon is like a grease pig. You get your arms around it, and then it wiggles and squiggles, and suddenly it's running off in a direction that you hadn't anticipated. And I cannot explain why it's a grease pig, but that's my description of it.
All right, that's a fair enough description. And actually, you mentioned the Raelians. I think a lot of people, they see a lot of old black and white video of, UFO alien religions based in the 50s, that came out of the 50s and 60s, spiritual groups, belief systems, what have you. But the Raelians are really alive and doing well to date. And you mentioned some wild ideas. I mean, is that something that you've ever explored a little bit in modern time?
Yes, I actually had a graduate student who spoke French and wrote a thesis, master's level thesis on the Raelians. So that was helpful. But I like the Raelians in the sense that not only are they contemporary with us, but they have this they have a real zeal for re-explaining previous religious sensibilities in materialist terms. For example, Rael claims in his original Close Encounter of the Third Kind that the aliens gave him a Bible study. And he read the book of Genesis, and they gave a material explanation for everything that, Jews, Christians, and Muslims think of as spiritual. Now, I find
sort of a new set of hermeneutics, basically.
Exactly. It's a new hermeneutic, and it is materialist in character. Mm-hmm. And then right around the late 1990s and early around 2000, if you may remember, and I'm sure you do, they had decided that they were going to attain immortality through genetic engineering, that is to say, cloning. Mm-hmm. And to my knowledge, no scientist to date has cloned a human being. But at that time, they thought, here, science can deliver through genetics what religious people previously had thought God would deliver. So I find this to be such an example, an extreme example, actually, of trying to secularize and then repackage classic religious beliefs in a material form. And that would be the case whether there were UFOs involved or not. So I like the Raelians because in their extremities, extremism, they almost sort of represent a major cultural trend.
Mm-hmm. Right. So if we want to really break this down, I think let's lay the groundwork a little bit. What do you call in this, and how do you relate it to this field? What do you call the demiurge?
Well, the demiurge in Plato or in ancient Gnosticism was that sort of transitional figure from the great cosmic abyss on the one hand to the concrete physical world that we have on the other. So let me ask you what gives rise to your question about the demiurge.
Well, I want to see where this falls into the UFO question, the visitations, the messengers.
Yes. Well, perhaps, and if I'm understanding your question correctly, we might say what the so-called ancient astronaut theorists that we see so much of on the History 2 television channel are saying, namely that the origins of the human race, as we currently understand it, the origins of human civilization, are due to a genetic experimental project that was launched by these aliens who were visiting Earth, and with their advanced extraterrestrial science and technology actually seeded evolutionary life here on Earth so that you and I would develop to become the intelligent beings that we are. And so it's an attempt to re-explain ancient myths and legends and archaeological artifacts and things with this material explanation, which then begs the question, well, where did the aliens come from? It just pushes it back. So the aliens are kind of like a contemporary demiurge, so to speak. It's the creator that we know, and we certainly still don't know where the demiurge might have come from. So is that the kind of thing you're looking for?
Yeah. Absolutely, it differentiates itself from my own demiurges. So if we can go on, I'd just like to get into this Dick Jackson late night encounter, 1975. I think starting with some of the symbolism that's here, I think this will really open up the ideas in the book for people a little bit better.
Yes,
can I go into that? Yeah.
Yeah, and thanks for asking this. You're right. It's a hermeneutical issue. That is to say, how do we interpret what's going on? And my assumption is that our religious sensibilities have become secularized, and so what we need to do is interpret what's going on. So in the Dick Jackson case, which I report in the book, Dick Jackson is unable to sleep in the middle of the night. He's in Naples, Florida. He goes outside, and there is a round, glowing flying saucer which has just landed. The light comes from within it, and it is round. So I immediately duck off to Carl Jung, the psychoanalyst, who says, well, roundness is a symbol of perfection. Okay, I buy that. And then he climbs, Dick Jackson is waved into the ship by a spaceling. He climbs 3 steps. I don't know what the 3 means. I suspect it means something. But what is important in his account is that he walks through the doorway inside the craft, and he said, vacuum cleaned.
Vacuum cleaned.
So what's vacuum cleaned? Well, what's he mean by that? I'm saying this is the rite of purification. He's passing from the profane world into the sacred world.
So this is like a baptism of sorts, basically.
It's a baptism, yeah. And in fact, I think he even used the word baptized on one occasion. But what's happening now is that, I asked him, are you a religious person? Oh, no, I'm not religious. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, I don't believe in God like other people do. Well, how do other people believe in God? He says they're like Santa Claus. I said, okay, so you're not religious. But he gets baptized, so to speak, as he walks into the craft. And how else will a non-religious person describe it? Well, inside the craft are these 2 beings that look very much like us. He said they look like Italians. I didn't ask Dick Jackson what his nationality was, but he said they look like Italians to me. And he then, his first question is, how does this machine work? And he gets that explained. Well, again, and by the way, I was raised in a family with engineers, so I understand that's one of the first questions I would have asked too. And so he gets the explanation of how it works, and then he gets the speech from one of the aliens who speaks in perfect English. So I interrupted Dick Jackson. I said, what do you mean perfect English? Well, his grammar was perfect. His diction was perfect.
That's good. He's well studied.
Oh, yeah, okay. But, that kind of fits with this cleansing experience in entering. And then, of course, the spaceling describes another planet where they want to take Earthlings to. They want to colonize this planet with Earthlings, and on this planet, everything will be provided for. In fact, he used this word "provided for" frequently. And so we won't have to work for our food. We won't have to work for this, that, and the next thing. But of course, there are some people for whom work is very meaningful. And if you want meaningful work, they'll give you that too. And as he's describing this, I said, well, Mr. Jackson, have you ever heard of this place before? Well, no. What do you mean? I said, it sounds a lot like heaven. Oh, yeah, he says, it's just like heaven, just like paradise. And so now we're going to go geographically from Earth to paradise. And the Spaceling wants to commission Dick Jackson to become a recruiter to get an entire colony. And I want to say this is like a call vision for the prophets in the Bible to some degree. And Dick Jackson turns them down. I said, why, Mr. Jackson, would you turn them down? He says, it's because I'm going to die. Well, what do you mean you're going to die? Well, I've got this disease and that disease, and I'm only going to live a couple more years. And I said, well, did you tell the spaceman that? Well, yeah, I did tell him that. Well, then you can guess what the spaceman says. We have doctors who can cure you of your disease so that you can live for centuries.
But they didn't, obviously, right?
Well, Dick Jackson said he would think about this. And so he left the ship, and they waved goodbye and all of that kind of thing. And then the ship flew away, and Dick Jackson went back to bed. Frankly, if I had an experience like that, I doubt if I would have gone back to bed. But what it struck me was that even though he had no religious vocabulary, I think what he was experiencing in very secular language was a visitation from another dimension of reality, another world, and it was really an invitation to salvation. Salvation meaning we'll cure your diseases and you can live a long time and the human race can prosper on this other planet. And so that's the kind of thing I look at. I don't really have an answer, so to speak, to the UFO mystery. I just think that if we ask, what do UFOs mean for us here on Earth? I think that if we do a little hermeneutics, a little translation of what people report, we'll see that these perennial religious structures of the other world coming into the present world, offering us a perfection that we don't have, and then, of course, making a promise that we could have a salvation in the future. But in this case, it's going to be a technological salvation. It's not going to be spiritual or religious in any classical sense. So that's kind of where I start the book and want to get in to understanding the meaning or significance or value of the UFO phenomenon for the wider culture.
Well, speaking of the materialism for just a sec, if we can go back. Now, you mentioned he was talking about a technology, a motor, something like that, and then you come from a family of engineers. Did you look at that and see if it made any sense, his description?
Well, actually, it did. My father and brother did a lot with electrical motors, and so when the spaceman opened up a panel inside the circular-shaped ship, what Dick Jackson said he saw was field winding. Now, that's all that wires that look like spaghetti, and if you take apart an electrical motor, that's what you'll see there, and it creates the magnetic field. And so then Dick Jackson concluded that the floor of inside the craft would be the armature. So from Dick Jackson's point of view, the flying saucer was a giant electric motor, and he was inside of it. So what is important for me is that it satisfied his scientific and technological curiosity, which was important to him.
Well, that materialistic vision, the materialism itself, the material,
Yes.
the familiarity of it all, is that the new way of passing on hopeful spiritual information? I mean, could in fact these beings be what some people believe to be aliens? Are they just coming in a different form?
Oh, I put into brackets the reality question, are they really aliens or not? I'm looking at the meaning question, and it appears to me that what Dick Jackson wants, whether he's aware of it or not, is that he wants a solution to life's existential problems, meaning of life, how to face death, how to improve the world in which we live, etc. And he is hoping, expecting that all the answers are going to come from science and technology. He's not going to look for the answers, by going to church or something of that nature. That's what I think is going on. So I think that would be the case, whether those aliens are real or whether they're a product of his imagination. I think that interpretation of them would stand.
Right, and some of these experiences, if we put aside for a second, if we say, okay, they're not fact, this didn't actually happen. A lot of people have dreams, right, that can parallel to this sort of experience.
I think that the dream hypothesis for explaining his experience is a reasonable one.
Okay.
I don't want to insult Mr. Jackson, though, by saying, well, you really had just a dream. I don't want to do that. I try to respect what they say, what interviewees say about their experience, and then offer an interpretation without necessarily saying they're mistaken or lying or whatever. Let me just say, I just don't do that. Let's face it looks a lot like a dream, and if I had a dream like that and it seemed real, I might talk that way. But one of the reasons why I don't want to wipe it off as a dream is, getting back to hermeneutics again, you and I can have a strange experience or encounter, and it's really there. And how we interpret it, how we make it meaningful for us, is very much a part of that experience. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that nothing happened for this to be meaningful for Mr. Jackson.
Right. Well, that's a tough thing, because I know for myself, from what I've seen, it was something outside. It was very simple. It was an experience. I had another witness with me.
Yeah.
And for a lot of other people, where they have corroboration, witnesses, these accounts, I mean, it's much easier to say, okay, this happened. This was real. Maybe we got it on video or photo, which is, usually not the case. But when you have multiple witnesses, that seems pretty rock solid to me. Whereas in these cases, how do you go about, looking at this and deciding whether something is or is not a truth?
Well, in the case of Dick Jackson, I did not make it my job to decide whether it was true or false.
Fair enough, yeah.
As a UFO investigator, however, I am concerned about that, and multiple witnesses, especially if they don't know each other, really heightens the credibility of a UFO experience.
Exactly.
And especially if you can combine an eyewitness account with, say, a radar tracking or something like that. All of those raise the level of credibility. And do we have those sightings in the files? You betcha we do. Lots of them. So I am not a skeptic in the sense of saying that, there's nothing to this phenomenon. I don't belong in that camp at all.
Okay. Well, with that said, man, if you could go over the 4 categories that you kind of break all this down into, I think that'll help us understand where you're coming from a theological standpoint,
Yes. So what I do in light of what I've just said, Alan, is I'll grant that there is something to the UFO phenomenon that prompts a terrestrial human response. And then what I do in the book is I try to show there are four structures of interpretation. That is to say, structures where we bring our cultural assumptions to bear. And one of them, to start with, is the political structure. I call it the interstellar diplomat. Are they coming here from an extraterrestrial political body in order to negotiate something with us on Earth? The answer is, well, yes. And case after case, we know exactly what is on their minds. They want us to stop the testing of nuclear weapons. They don't want to see a war on planet Earth of this particular scope. And so the contactees, as well as some of the abductees and others, keep reporting that that's what's on the mind of the aliens. Well, let's face it, it's on our minds too, or at least it was.
Oh, sure.
In the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And remember, Ronald Reagan got elected in 1980 largely on the fear factor. He said we could fight a limited thermonuclear war and only lose 40 million people dead. And
absolutely insane. Yeah.
Right. So it is on our minds, and it's only natural, so to speak, that you and I might interpret the political significance of visitations from outer space in these terms. More recently, interestingly enough, the spacelings are concerned about the environmental crisis on Earth. And so if you compare the two versions of the movie, The Day the Earth Stood Still, 1951, where the issue was nuclear weapons, and then 2007 for the second one, it was the ecological crisis, you can see that the culture has shifted, and so also has the interpretation of flying saucers. So that's my first model.
Okay.
And then the second one, which we've kind of been talking about, is what I call the research scientists. Some of the early UFO close encounters of the third kind actually had witnesses saying that beings would get out of a flying saucer and dig around in the dirt and take soil samples back into the craft with them, as if, they had a 7th grade science class there on Zeta 2 Reticuli or something like that.
May have a 7th grade class.
And of course, the abductees of the 1960s and 70s kept reporting a physical examination. I interviewed Charlie Hickson of the October 11th, 1973 Pascagoula, Mississippi abduction, and they had this kind of camera that went all around his body. And so what do you think they were doing, Charlie? Well, they were doing an examination. Well, the question is why? Well, we can imagine they were doing, physiology classes there on Zeta 2 Reticuli as well. So you got this model of the research scientist. Then the third one is the celestial savior, and that's where this so-called advanced science and technology comes to Earth in order to give us what we don't have. And so in the case of Dick Jackson, it's going to be, hundreds of years of life curing his disease, or frequently they're going to give us world peace whether we want it or not.
Well, is the savior model, is that pervasive more so than any of the other models?
It is implicit in some of those that have the political and the scientific models, because the UFOnauts are going to deliver a form of salvation which is very material in character, but is something that we hunger for. In some cases, it's actually spiritualized, but usually it's quite a material form of salvation. And one of the I wrote two versions of this book. The first one was published in 1977, and I finished with the three models. And it appeared to me that all UFO witnesses who had close encounters of the third kind thought of the aliens as at minimum benign and at maximum as salvific, as bringing us good things.
True, but if you look at Bud Hopkins' studies, a lot of those reports are kind of damning, don't you think?
Oh, they are, but look when Bud Hopkins gave those reports. It was in the mid-1980s. And what I think was going on, and this is what warranted the second edition of the book, was a revisionist history took place in your town, New York City, with Bud Hopkins and Whitley Strieber and David Jacobs, and to some extent John Mack coming down from Boston. And we ended up with my fourth model then, the hybridizer model, in which you have these really negative reports of close encounters of the third kind, which is a shift away from the celestial savior. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, no, I just could imagine if I was in that situation. I mean, I'd be shaking in my boots. It would totally blow my mind. I don't think I would feel safe or stable for some time, for sure.
Well, it's important that you say that, because that leads to a couple of complex dimensions. First of all, in the pre-modern world, when people had an experience with God, it scared the crap out of them. That's why Rudolf Otto called that the Mysterium Tremendum, where people really did get frightened when they were confronted by God. Yeah. And so if we run this down then to, say, John Mack's work, which I think is a good deal more subtle and nuanced than the other three, John Mack could report that the people he interviewed who had these really negative experiences with alien abductions said that over a period of time they reinterpreted their earlier interpretation of the experience, and they gave it a more positive spin and began to see it as a religious turning point in their lives. So the idea that you're confronted with something that's transcendent and it scares the crap out of you is only a part of the experience. It's not necessarily the whole thing. Mm-hmm. And that in the long run, most of these, you know what, I don't want to say most. I just want to say that John Mack reported that a lot of these people turned towards the positive. Be that as it may, what we need to leave stand is that what I think was the dominant view from 1947 to 87 was the celestial savior, either neutral or positive interpretation of aliens, and the negative one really begins only 25 or 30 years ago.
Well, I was thinking about, as you were talking, the David Jacobs reports, and he talked about mind scans and arousals. It doesn't sound too bad to me, man. I'm just saying. I don't know.
Yeah. I think on the mind scans, I think David is appealing to what I call the research scientist model. Mm-hmm. I actually don't know the importance of the arousals, if it has anything to do with hybridization or not. So I hesitate to comment on that.
Well, I think some of them were reported without any connection to the hybridization. It was just sort of a something that happened.
Oh,
But yeah, so you know what? Let's talk about God, if we can, because behind all this, like you say, there's this religious symbolism, and so really, if we go back, most people, if we're talking about in the U.S., most people, even if they're not religious, they claim not to be religious, like myself. We were raised under a certain doctrine or dogma or religion, Catholicism, Protestant, what have you. So even if you graduate for yourself and you say, I'm not religious anymore, don't you think that those archetypal images are still embedded in the subconscious? Because I know, I still have a fascination with the Catholic Church, even though I'm not Catholic anymore. I'm still interested in what's going on and reading Gnostic Gospels and the such.
My answer is yes. I use slightly different words to describe that. You used archetypes. Maybe you have Carl Jung in mind. My word for that is religious sensibilities. So I would think that if you and I are confronted with the infinite, as we might if we look through a telescope or something like that,
Sure.
that there are certain religious sensibilities which are going to persist in our psyches, even if we stop going to church. And when we that Dick Jackson case, I just one of my points was that his religious sensibilities were alive and well.
Right.
It's just that he was unable to articulate those sensibilities in religious categories, so they came out sublimated or displaced, so to speak, in secular categories. So a large part of what I do in the book is try to show how these religious sensibilities, or what you're calling the archetypes, they are alive and well.
Yeah.
And in the secular world, and there's something about that UFO phenomenon which, really wakes them up and starts drawing our attention towards them.
Yeah. Well, it makes me wonder if somebody was raised an atheist, let's say, and that had virtually no experience in church mythology. They haven't really digested that much. Would those people look to things like the Nephilim in the Bible? Would they look at that and say and relate that to a UFO experience, or do you think that only happens if it's somebody who is already familiar with the Bible and that mythology there?
Well, for that question, I think I would probably just want to ask the people that you have in mind, and see how they might answer that.
So you've not come across anyone who's outspokenly said, I'm an atheist, I was raised atheist, and this happened to me anyway?
Oh, well, the answer would be yes on the question of whether or not they had an extraordinary experience. With regard to going back to reread Genesis chapter 6 and try to see whether or not the Nephilim that are mentioned there are, really space aliens. Most atheists that I know don't have sufficient interest in doing that. Who does? Well, it's somebody that was raised Christian and kind of gave it up, but they're still fascinated with the Bible. And so Rael or the ancient astronaut theorists, Eric von Däniken, can come along and say, hey, I'll give you an explanation for that. And I think those are the kinds of people that get curious more than likely. Let me just say that's what I've run into, and I hesitate to speak for other people when they can, speak for themselves. But that's kind of the way I would size it up. What do you think, Alan? Because you got that question there. I'll bet you are interested in Genesis chapter 6. Are you?
Well, just a little bit. I just want to nail down really fast, if I can, what your opinion is on the Nephilim specifically. Do you think that it's even remotely possible, that they are actual?
I'll give you a yes on the remotely possible.
Oh, okay. I'll leave it there.
Yes, I don't have the kind of expert opinion that I would want you to go and repeat somewhere. Oh, Dr. Peters thinks such and such. Yeah. Well, I have a hard time interpreting that one.
Well, any of these cases you've studied, has anyone specifically used that term Nephilim to describe?
Oh, of course, of course. And the hybridizer model that describes some of these cases described in the late 1980s and through the 1990s. The idea of the Nephilim comes up again and again as a kind of precursor or model where the sons of heaven marry the daughters of earth. And there are many ancient astronaut theorists, as you well know, who want to argue that it was this marriage of the spacelings with your and my pre-human ancestors that created the genome that allowed the human race to develop the kind of intelligence and science and technology that we have. Let me just say, I think that's a coherent point of view. I'm certainly not going to fault it on its coherence. Whether or not it fits the empirical evidence, to me, that's where you'd have to kind of argue it out.
Yeah, well, I think, if I can speak from a more personal point of view, when you're raised with a religion, you find, and I don't mean to offend anyone else out there, but sorry if I do, but you find comfort in the religion. You find comfort in the ritual. You find comfort in the stories. So I think it's easy to look for something else, because once even if you intellectualize for yourself, I think once you let that go, there's something missing. There's something that you need to fill a little void there. And I can't speak for everybody, but I can speak for myself. There's a mystery out there, and when you first hear about the ancient astronaut theory and these correlations between the Bible and the scientized UFO, then I think it's easy to transition into that, don't you think?
Yes, I do, and I would concur that our religious traditions, our church life, our worship life, does communicate comfort in many ways. It's kind of like the nest that is safe and sound while the mommy and daddy robins are there to take care of us. And if we leave the nest, it's a cold, cruel world out there. So now I kind of want to ask you, Alan, so if once you've left the nest of the Roman Catholic Mass, and then you take a look at Genesis 6 and the Nephilim, and you find the ancient astronaut theorists can provide an explanation, does it give you comfort that you can say, hey, I can have both the Bible on the one hand, and I can have science and technology on the other? So, so just what's going on with you there when you think about this?
Well, for myself, it's not so much about needing any sort of confirmation of the truth of the Bible. It's just more that spiritual something that's missing. And for me, when I had left the Catholic Church, I transitioned for a short time into reading up on Buddhism and that sort of thing. Now I find that it's the mystery that I actually love living in. It's the ongoing questions. And I've sort of accepted that that's my happy place, as far as living a spiritual life. I'm endlessly fascinated with these topics, and that's why Epic Voyages is covering a wide variety, because there's this overlap between people's need, including mine, to not just find out what the mystery is, but even if we don't solve the mystery, to actually live in it. There's something deeply satisfying about that. And I think scientists feel the same way. Even if an atheist, they look out at the cosmos and they just see this awe and wonder. And that's the comfort that they get. That's where I come from.
Well, let me put on my Roman Catholic hat for a minute.
Okay. Oh, it looks good.
My St. Thomas Aquinas hat. If I were a Catholic, one of the things I would note is that the first and most important thing that Roman Catholics have to say about God is that God is mysterious in character. And St. Thomas, kind of like you, sent his mind on the epic voyage, and he said one of the greatest experiences we can have, in fact, he described heaven in terms of the beatific vision, where your and my mind would be attuned to the mystery of God. And you know what? God stays mysterious. Once you have this close relationship with God, it doesn't eliminate the mystery. The mystery perdures in that case, but we have a relationship to it. Anyway, that's one thing I would just want to mention. I think Catholicism at its best loves the mystery. Then another comment, which is kind of a smart aleck comment, and it has to do with C.S. Lewis. And Lewis wrote a book, I think it was called The Great Divorce, and we had these religious seekers in the book, and they get to go to heaven. And they get on the doorsteps of heaven, and then, I don't know, an angel or somebody says, well, in heaven, all of your great questions will be answered. They said, well, we don't want to go in there. We like the questions. We don't want the answers. So I don't find myself in that situation. But at any rate, my bottom line is, boy, you're not alone in your epic voyages. St. Thomas is going to be in the boat with you.
Yep, indeed. And actually, before we get to the break, I just want to ask you a quick question. Do you have any comments on soul memory transfer procedures done to abductees temporarily to clones or hybrids? I don't know if you're familiar with Barbara Bartholic or Carla Turner and today's Dr. Corrado Malanga from Italy.
No, I am not familiar. I have studied genetics, and to my understanding, molecular biologists would not grant that memory could pass from one generation to another. But I don't know the people you're speaking of, so I hesitate to say more than that.
Well, I mean, in any of the reports, did anyone have a transfer of memory, like something like a download that was maybe something from a past life? I'm thinking in terms of karma, while we're on.
Yeah. I understand what you're thinking of. I did study for a number of years New Age spirituality, and that includes reincarnation therapy, where one retrieves past memories. But you can have that with or without the UFO phenomenon. The Unarius Society in San Diego, for example, combined the whole UFO worldview with reincarnation and reincarnation therapy, and Archangel Uriel actually claimed that the euphonauts in orbit were keeping records of who we were in previous incarnations, and we could then use a form of reincarnation therapy to retrieve the decisions we made in previous lives. I don't know if that's what you have in mind there. You may be familiar with a school of thought there that might be new to me.
No, I mean, that's a pretty good comment on that. I think we can just leave that there for the moment. So we're actually going to be going into the break soon. Ted, really quick, what are the websites that you have?
My website is called tedstimelytake.com, tedstimelytake.com. I've got books available. I've got some essays that I've written, and lots of resources that deal with the interaction between faith and natural science. So anybody's welcome to visit Ted's Timely Take.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ted. We're going to go ahead and take a quick break. If everybody can stick around, there's so much more meat to get to. So stay tuned with Epic Voyages Radio on Inception Radio Network. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Epic Voyages on Inception Radio Network. This is Alan Smith, your host, with our guest, Ted Peters. Real quick, if any of you are on Instagram, you can follow me on Instagram at AlanSNYC, at ALANSNYC, where I'll be updating coming up shows and a slew of other images that I hope you'll enjoy. Hey, Ted, so before we jump back in, where would we leave off on the fourth step there?
Well, the four models of interpretation are the interstellar diplomat, or the political model. The second is the research model. The third is the celestial savior. Then the fourth is the word hybridizer, to refer to those kinds of cases reported by your New York friends, Whitley Strieber and David Jacobs, Bud Hopkins, and coming down from Boston there, John Mack, where a person, usually a woman, but there are some men who report being abducted from their bed in the middle of the night, taken through the ceiling or walls or whatever to a hovering spacecraft. Mm-hmm. Then, in this spacecraft, they're laid out on a table and their body is examined. So far, this is looking like what I call the scientific researcher model. And the grays seem to be officious and scientific, kind of like our graduate students running around the laboratory. And they don't have too much personality, but they're doing their scientific work. So all of that fits the scientific research model. But then something happens that is unique, or somewhat unique, and that is that their sexual organs are given special attention and women are impregnated. They describe this as really not very sexual in character. It's really a reproductive technology of one kind or another. Mm-hmm. And this impregnation includes the genes of both the celestial visitors as well as the terrestrial host. And that's why in the earlier segment we talked about the connection with the Nephilim in Genesis chapter 6, where the sons of men and the daughters of earth, the sons of heaven and the daughters of earth have these conjugal relations. Well, then, as you undoubtedly know, these abductees report later subsequent abductions. They're taken aboard the craft. When the baby is born, they are sometimes asked periodically to visit their child in the craft. And I find this really very interesting, and you hear it from David Jacobs especially, that the Greys want to see a terrestrial mother showing love and affection to the baby. So you get this kind of scenario developing that the Greys have this kind of scientific mindset, and they want to improve their own extraterrestrial race by learning from us how tenderness and love and affection and those kinds of things can actually influence the species. So it's almost a reverse of the ancient astronaut theory, where according to the ancient astronaut theorists, we are the product of an advance by these aliens, and now the aliens want to advance by something they can get from us. I just want to say that's a different model than what dominated the UFO phenomenon for the first 40 years, even though these days, over the last 25 years or so, you get a lot of reports like this. And it's my job to try to figure out what all of this means. And I have to tell you, I don't quite have all the answers.
Well, yeah, obviously it seems like a contradiction on the surface. But, if we were to assume that these aliens have been here for thousands of years, it could just be an ongoing experiment, couldn't it?
Yes, one could make up a story. I haven't seen this yet, but maybe the genetic experiment that began thousands of years ago with the interbreeding of aliens and earthlings now is at another stage where maybe we on Earth have been incubating certain genes. Mm-hmm. that now they want to take advantage of in outer space. I'm not in the mood for writing a science fiction novel, but it might be a humdinger.
It might be. So yeah, with these abductions and the impregnation, this harkens back to the Bible. These are sort of virgin births. What do you have to say about that? I mean, is there some need or desire by people to feel that? That seems like an odd thing to feel like, okay, I need to feel like I'm part of this sort of miraculous birthing process in terms of symbolism.
I think that's a fair question, Alan, and I actually have not thought about it, but it's kind of an obvious question, actually, when you think of Gabriel impregnating Mary, the mother of our Lord, in that fashion, that all of these impregnations could be leading to messiahs. Let me just say that's not there in the literature. I don't see that in Bud Hopkins. In fact, I think Bud Hopkins, he's passed away now, but I think he would almost rebel against that interpretation because he tended in his writings to be sort of anti-religious. I don't know what David Jacobs might think about that. Let me just say in general, those who report these hybridizer abductions don't talk about their children in messianic terms. If they would have, I think it would be quite obvious that we might have a duplication of Jesus here. But I don't see that. You can see it in the Raelian group, but then they have a whole ideology, and most abductees don't really have an ideology. They're just traumatized.
Right, but the majority of the abductees are they religious people?
That I don't know, and that would be a sociological question. According to John Mack, with whom I did spend considerable time, and he was the psychiatrist, recall, who did in-depth initial interviews and follow-ups with a number of these abductees who had the negative experience. He says they're religious. That doesn't mean they go to church, but they're religious in the sense that this extraordinary experience takes on religious meaning for them as they interpret their experience over time.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Bible, and I keep going back to the Bible because it's so central to this. Any of these experiencers would have different perspectives, whether they were religious or not. But particularly anybody who is religious or was raised religious would have different interpretations of the Bible. I mean, for instance, some people would see the translation of the Virgin Mary as not being a virgin, as being a young woman. If you look at God, I mean, is God a man? All these patriarchal societies that came down from this religion. I mean, did he have genitalia? I mean, where do these things fall into the perspectives of the individuals? Were you able to see that at all?
Well, I certainly understand what you're saying theologically. Nobody in the history of Christian theology actually thought that God was a man who impregnated Mary.
Mm-hmm. But he is referred to as a he.
The idea of Gabriel brings us back to the demiurge that you had mentioned earlier. Gabriel's kind of like a demiurge, somewhere between heaven and earth. But the idea that Jesus is the Son of God doesn't mean that Jesus carries 23 chromosomes that are divine. I don't think anybody would say that in the Christian tradition. But the connection between heaven and earth, and you and I in a separate conversation had discussed shamanism. In the ancient world, just in general, mm-hmm. the connection between heaven and earth was really important. You had high places, mountains or ziggurats or things of that nature that connected heaven and earth. And then the shaman, usually the medicine man and the tribe, also connected heaven and earth in one fashion or another. And That's the religious sensibility which is being evoked in the story of the Virgin Mary being conceiving the child of Gabriel, etc. And I think that sensibility is at work in the hybridization phenomenon. It's very sublimated, it's very muted, but I think it's there. So I wouldn't draw a straight line, say, from Mary's virginal conception to the people who are abducted today by UFOs, but it's a circuitous line because it goes through the more general religious sensibility that we know of as shamanism, this connection between heaven and earth. I think that may be at work, even though it's not a direct theological parallel.
So in a way, a lot of these experiencers, they're basically unwilling shamans. Is that sort of what
Hey, I like that. They are clearly unwilling. The contactees were willing. But these abductees are not willing. They're taken against their will.
Well, that's really interesting.
The result is they become shamans, Yeah,
I mean, a lot of people out there would want to have an experience,
you
right?
Betcha.
I mean, and it's the people who don't expect it, that don't want it, they get it. I mean, that's isn't that the story of the prophet?
Yeah, well, that's the story of the prophet. Megalomaniacs amongst us would just love to claim, that they've had this experience because it would give them religious authority or public authority, and the contactees exploited that. But you're right about most of the prophets in ancient Israel, Amos or Jeremiah or Isaiah. They did not volunteer for the job. They were hornswoggled into it. And to some degree, the contemporary hybridized earthlings are similar in that fashion, although I've not actually tried to draw out the parallels very far.
Yeah, I mean, I suspect my response would be no thanks, but hey, we can have a cup of coffee. But no, I'm not going to be a prophet.
Right.
We can chat, but no, we're not going there. Yeah. And actually, I want to get into the symbolism part a little bit more. One of my favorite parts of the book, we were talking about the Phoenix, and I think it was Betty Andreasson had this vision of the Phoenix and the light. Can you break down the symbolism for us there?
Well, in Betty Andreasson's case, which is fascinating, we have an example of what you were asking about 10 minutes ago, namely, Betty Andreasson is a devout Christian, and even though she had repeated abduction experiences, these did not conflict with her faith, they only reinforced her faith. So whether Betty Andreasson is typical or atypical, it's hard for me to say, but I'm going to venture an unconfirmable hypothesis. I'll bet it's typical rather than atypical. Mm-hmm. Now, what she experienced or claims she has experienced with her encounters with aliens reinforces her basic Christian commitments, even though she didn't know it at first. And so the vision of the Phoenix, which she had as part of an ecstatic experience, actually becomes a confirmation of her Christian vision. The myth of the Phoenix is not a Christian myth. It predates.
Not in and of itself, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. But it's not unusual for Christians to take the myth of the Phoenix and say, hey, the resurrection of Christ is a lot like the story of the Phoenix. And to my reading, by the way, I've not met Betty Andreasson. I think I would like to, but I've not met her yet. It strikes me that once she was interviewed and she was able to tell her story and then get it fed back to her, then she could see the connection between this vision, and we're talking about a vision here, and her own faith commitment. So this was a good case or a good example of how when you and I interpret a strange experience, we're going to do it in light of the categories and structures of meaning that we already have. And in the case of Betty Andreessen, it only reinforced in a very robust way things that she'd already, come to believe as a member of a Christian church.
Well, now, if this was an aberration of the mind, though, why would it be a phoenix? Why not something that she can directly relate to her religion?
I think that's a legitimate question, and I'll just kind of repeat what I said earlier. I think there are some generic religious sensibilities which the human race just has.
Mm-hmm.
And dealing with the existential question of death and what happens afterward is, just there. And the Phoenix story is just one that fits that whole question of death, usually not an individual's death, but the death of a civilization, which you can find a comparable example in the prophet Ezekiel in ancient Israel, where Israel is virtually dead. And Ezekiel has a vision of the valley of the dry bones, and them bones go to rise again. The flesh comes on the bones, etc. So that's almost a parallel to the Phoenix story within the context of Israel. And so that's why I suggest that we're dealing here with a religious sensibility, and the Phoenix is one symbolic articulation of it. The Valley of the Dry Bones is another. What I would like to do would be to change from Betty Andreessen and go to another case to try to illustrate what I mean by interpretation, if you'll allow me to do that.
Go right ahead.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So with this next account, UFO sighting account, I want to look at how it is that your and my frame of reference influences the way we interpret a strange experience. So here it goes. Okay. I was a UFO investigator from MUFON in the state of Louisiana some years ago. And I got called to interview two firemen who had had a strange experience within 36 hours of their experience. And here's what they told me. It was night. They were out in a boat with an outboard motor in the bayous, and they were shooting nutria. And I understand nutria are a water furry animal like a beaver or something. They shoot and they eat it. And so they have their shotguns, and while they're trolling in the bayou, they see a star that's getting larger and larger, and they describe it as a light descending. And this light gets bigger and bigger as it gets closer and closer, and finally it stops about 75 feet above them. The boat is bathed in the light beam now, and the boat stops moving. The outboard motor is still churning the water. The boat is not moving, and the two men become paralyzed, physically paralyzed. One of them actually has the hair on his head stand out on end, like we think of as a frightened person. They can talk with one another and hear one another, but their bodies don't function. So they talk about shooting it, but neither one of them can physically move their shotgun, in order to shoot the thing. So they're having a conversation all along while this is happening. And then after a period of time, the light shoots up away and disappears, and then the boat continues to cruise as it does normally. Well, needless to say, they did not continue hunting. They went racing home and, of course, told their wives, etc., what was happening. And I arrived the next night now, and I'm interviewing them. I've got my tape recorder going and all the things that are normal. So I asked, well, what do you think it was? I don't know what it was. It was just a bright light. Well, where do you think it came from? I have no idea where it came from. It was just this bright light, and we were paralyzed, and this, that, and the next thing. So they didn't have vocabulary. They didn't have conceptions. They could only describe this traumatic and exciting experience. So I took my notes and everything. Now, 2 weeks later, I go back for a second interview. And in the meantime, their wives have read all kinds of books about flying saucers and UFOs and this, that, and the next thing. And I repeat some of my questions. What do you think it was? Well, it was a spaceship from another planet. And, you know, they're more highly evolved than we are here, and they're more advanced in science and technology, and they're coming here to do this, that, and the next thing. And I want to say in that 2-week period of time, the whole myth developed because of the interaction there of the wives reading the literature and telling their husbands, hey, this is what happened to you. So what I think is working, and what I try to say in the book, is we've got these 4 models, and they're let loose in our culture. And so if you and I have a really strange or an anomalous experience, there's something within us that wants to interpret it, wants to find out what it was, wants to find out what it means, and we're going to go to what's handy. And I think these 4 models, so to speak, are what's handy. And so even though the raw experience we might not have words for, boy, it's not long and we got it all figured out.
Yeah. And you noticed you mentioned the bright lights. I mean, that's enlightenment, right? I mean, that's.
Oh yes, light is in almost every culture the symbol of knowledge, and that would be a good thing to press with these 2 firemen. But I have to say, I didn't see how it worked in this case because they didn't claim any new knowledge that they didn't have before. But it is the right question to ask.
Yeah. Well, nor do I see the furry creatures as being enlightening either. But,
I don't think I wanted to see a nutria, frankly.
It's a great name, though. I love it.
Yeah.
So let's get back to. I really want to get back to this messianic message.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned nuclear, you mentioned environment. What about for the soul? What about for the individual? What are they getting at?
Boy, that is an excellent question. If you can move a little bit into the New Age, and the New Age is just one of the slippery pig dimensions of the UFO phenomenon, they'll have all the answers with regard to the reintegration of the soul with the body in this great evolutionary epic. And definitely enlightenment comes in the form of, of a deepened and expanded consciousness, where we realize our unity of our own consciousness with the great consciousness that underlies the universe. It's really a combination of Hindu mysticism with Darwinian evolution. It's curious. That's the New Age version, and the UFO aliens become for us adepts or teachers to help us along that way. For the most part, your kind of central ufology people who really see science and technology as their framework for understanding. For them, enlightenment...
Right, Ted, I'm going to interrupt you real fast. We'll pick it up after this really quick break. And more enlightenment from Ted Peters coming up on Epic Voyages Radio on Inception Radio Network. Thank you, everyone, for staying with us tonight and hanging around the bonfire. We'll be right back.
Situation, flying solo next to you. Now it feels less shady, finding what to say and do. Wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't that be nice? You see, lately I've been searching for that smile I left behind. And I know I could find it if my life went upside down. Wouldn't that be nice?
Welcome back, everyone, to Epic Voyages Radio. This is Alan Smith, your guest host tonight. Before we jump back in with Ted Peters, just want to give you all a reminder that we have open lines tonight. And if you would like to give a call and join this conversation, the number is 888-919-2355. 888-919-2355. Press option 1 to connect to the studio. And a real quick update, I thought y'all would really appreciate this. And many of you probably have already found out online, the X-Files may be getting rebooted. The whole shebang, full cast, Mulder and Scully. Everybody is on board. According to Fox CEO Dana Walden, who worked with Chris Carter on the original series, said, quote, "We're very hopeful, but it's hard. The actors are very busy. They have a lot going on. Chris has a lot on his plate, so it's just trying to carve out the time," end quote. This sounds like it's in the works. And if you go online, you can check out, there's so many articles on this right now. It's all a buzz. I'm just really stoked. I love that show. That was one of my favorite shows and still is of all time. So I'd be ecstatic if it came back. Ted, did you ever watch the X-Files and get into that?
You know, Alan, it's one of the big lacuna in my life that I'm Star Trek, yes. X-Files, no.
Okay. All right, we'll leave it at that. Well, if the reboot comes, I implore you, go back to Netflix or wherever it is playing.
I will take your advice. Yeah.
Yes, and the quick path would be to follow the mythological alien thread, so you don't have to watch all the episodes. You can just watch that thread of episodes that works on that myth arc. But anyway, yeah, so let's jump back in, and can you break down for us, and I think, is this your term? I'm not sure, astrotheology?
It's my term. Some years ago, a few of us were using the word exotheology because Carl Sagan had coined the term exobiology. But in the 1990s, NASA and others started using the phrase, the term astrobiology to refer to various space sciences that were concerned about extraterrestrial life. And the excitement has arisen, as you know, over the last 20 years now. We've been discovering exoplanet after exoplanet, and the prospect of finding Earth-sized planets in the habitable zone is just going up. And so here at the Center for Theology and Natural Sciences in Berkeley, we're thinking, hey, I think those of us in the churches need to be talking about space research, about outer space, about the prospect of sharing our universe with extraterrestrial intelligent creatures, and what that could mean for us here on planet Earth, and what that could mean for our relationship to God, and what kinds of ethical or moral responsibilities might we have. So that's the agenda of astrotheology, which looks at UFOs, but it's tied a little bit more closely with astrobiology and the sciences.
Okay. And before we get to the open lines, I'm going to quote a little something here from the book. No, God is not a space alien. I'm going to read actually from the Bible. Exodus 23:4 reads, "You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven or above, that is on earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth." So what is your take on God is not a space alien?
Okay. UFOs, God's Chariots, question mark. I have two answers, yes and no. Let's try the no first,
Yes.
which is what you're raising up. It's easy for us to find substitutes for the true God, to find an idol in one fashion or another.
Sure.
And so belief that we are being visited by extraterrestrials more advanced than we are in science and technology, who can save us from our troubles, risks idolatry. So in that sense, no, UFOs are not God's chariots. However, there's a second way in which I can answer yes, and that is one of the persistent messages that the UFO phenomenon has delivered from the late 1940s right on down to the present time is we on Earth need to put away our weapons of mass destruction. We need to embrace world peace. And as I said earlier, more recently, we've even heard the spacelings telling us to take care of our planet so that we don't commit ecocide. Well, I think these messages coming from the spacelings, whether they're really there or just the messages we think we want to hear from them, are just like Jeremiah and Isaiah and Amos and ancient Israel. They are prophetic messages that saying, hey, the human race needs to shape up, take responsibility, and provide a planetary existence in which all life can flourish. And I want to say, if that's the message that we hear from the UFO phenomenon, yeah, I think that's God speaking, and it doesn't matter whose voice it is. It's a good message.
Yeah, I'd say they're damn right if that's the message. All right, so let's go to open lines. Get it on. All right, give us a call. Again, that number is 888-919-2355, 888-919-BELL, Bell. Option 1 to connect to the studio. Right, and before we get the first caller, I just want to bring up one thing. You also said, we need to keep in mind that though the Bible is the Word of God, it is still written in the words of us humans. So basically, are you saying that there's fault?
I think we should read the Bible between the lines. I think the Bible is the Word of God in the singular, but not the words of God. I don't think that we should treat every passage in a way that we think is literally the case. The Bible is not a religious version of the U.S. Constitution, for example. Go ahead now.
So in that case, I mean, you can look at the messengers, the aliens, be they gray, reptilian, whatever their message is, passing a message to the receiver, and the receiver passing it on to others. Again, we're left with human fault and interpretation, right?
Well, the answer is yes, categorically yes. I believe that God works in, with, and under natural things. And so God's word is not found in the words on the page of the Bible, but in, with, and under those words in a way that enters our hearts and enters our minds and creates a relationship, a loving relationship with God and with our neighbor. So again, it's I don't take the Bible like I would the U.S. Constitution or like an instruction manual for how to operate my Honda. It's a very different kind of book. And then there's also this listening part of it. The word understanding in English means to stand under something. When we read the Bible, we should be asking, hey, I wonder what the Holy Spirit is saying to me, not demand somehow or other that the Bible mean what I want it to mean. So there's a lot of nuance and subtlety here, and again, I don't see the Bible as a sort of divine human contract of sorts.
Okay, but you are a pastor, right, Ted?
I am, yes. I'm a Lutheran pastor.
Lutheran pastor. So, with all this said, though, you have to. Does it challenge you? Does it challenge your religion in any way? The experience that the abductees or experiencers tell and share?
Actually, no. I hadn't really thought about it that way. I love science, and I love what science tells us about the natural world. And my own approach to the UFO phenomenon, frankly, is to side with the group of people who take a more or less scientific approach to the UFO phenomenon, because I like to learn. I like to know more. But even though I try to alert the reader in the book about temptations to idolatry, I think the real idol is not likely to be the spaceling. The real idol is likely to be science and technology right here on Earth. And science and technology cannot save the human race. I don't care how much we appreciate it, even though medical science can provide great cures for human maladies. Atomic science can provide bombs that kill hundreds of thousands. So science is going to be ambiguous, and so is technology. God is not. God is not ambiguous. God, drives a stake in the ground on behalf of love and compassion, and even nonviolence. If you and I can possibly embrace that. So no, I haven't really felt challenged in terms of my own wishes and desires. Well, frankly, there's a part of me that just hopes we have space neighbors out there, and that our astrobiologists are actually able to locate and establish communication. And I'm looking forward to a covered dish dinner with those citizens of Zeta 2 Reticuli as soon as possible.
Well, I mean, with the work of the Kepler, I mean, obviously we're getting closer little by little to finding out whether they're actually out there.
Oh, yes.
I think we will. Yeah.
I just hope that tomorrow we find out. We're not alone.
Yep. And so something really interesting that you said. You said in the book, when his message is presented, I think we should listen. And how does that apply to the UFO?
Well,
and who is he?
In this case, it's Asteron, and Asteron was a voice that interrupted a television station in Great Britain some years ago. And Asteron interrupted the general programming and said, Earthlings, I come to you from outer space, and we think that the planet Earth is in danger of a thermonuclear exchange which will utterly destroy life on your planet, and we're telling you, stop it. Put away those weapons and embrace world peace. And the executives for the station came out a couple days later. They said, don't worry, you'll never hear this message again on our network. And I'm thinking, why not? It's a great message. I don't care whether it comes from outer space or not,
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people are listening to the messages. It's a huge following on this field online. The problem is just not getting disseminated into the media.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that what you're saying is fairly novel, even though you've been saying it for 30-something years. This is an aspect you never will hear on mainstream media. It's either the nuts and bolts. Shake it off as a misidentified craft, and that's the end of it. We just got some viewers because we advertised we're going to talk about this subject, but we really didn't talk about this subject.
Well, the media contracted Alzheimer's disease about 1950.
They did.
And they have only one question, and that is, are the believers and the skeptics ever going to get together? And so that's the only question they ask. And this idea that there could be nuance and texture and all kinds of complexities associated with the phenomenon, it's just never dawned on a reporter. And unless, they continue asking the same old questions they asked 70 years ago. And if it's not for your radio show, Epic Voyages, I mean, there's no way to even discuss the complexities here because the media can't hear it.
Right. Well, that's why early in the show, I asked our listeners to, try and be as persistent as possible, and I think it's going to work more effectively on the local media. When I say local media, I'm speaking more of television. I think of George Knapp out in Las Vegas. I mean, there's that's what that smaller scope, or I shouldn't say smaller scope, but that scope of listeners and community. I think when a community speaks, I think that those local stations hear it more than obviously the national syndicated stations. And I think we just have to keep pressing on because more and more people are aware of this right now because of the internet. And I think just the next stage is overflowing the internet, just bombarding and spreading the word and writing more articles and creating more shows and websites. And eventually we will get there. I believe that we will.
Well, I appreciate your optimism and your enthusiasm. I'd put George Noory in your camp. I don't know if you feel like he belongs in your camp or not, but I think he's willing and able to handle some of the complexities of all of this in a way that's, somewhat inspiring.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There's absolutely no doubt about that. All right. So what about let me just read something here for you.
Yeah.
The Hebrews would never knowingly have worshipped spacelings. They would have condemned such a practice as being idolatry. But what if this is what the ETs wanted?
Whoa, that's an interesting conspiracy theory, and I'm trying to read the person's mind who penned that. I think that if the ancient Hebrews, we're talking probably about the book of Exodus maybe, would have understood that a spaceling would have been somebody of flesh and blood who comes from a world that's very much like ours, I think you're right. The Hebrews would not have mistaken astronauts for the God of Israel. I think that's really safe to say. Those kinds of thoughts never dawned on the ancient Hebrew mind, to be sure. But then this questioner is suggesting that maybe this is a plot hatched by the spacelings so that the ancient Hebrews would develop their view of God and that this would serve some alien purpose. So I find that interesting. Let me just say I cannot imagine what the next steps in that argument would be.
Well, I can think of a couple of steps. If you look at the ancient astronaut theory, I think this could either defend that theory, or it could harm that theory. Because the idea of ancient astronaut theory is that these people mistook these visitors.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Right, but in the book, what you were talking about is that God is not, and we touched on this earlier, is not a physical being. There's some anthropomorphism that we've tossed onto the gods that we worship, but the fact is, you're saying that those people then knew clearly that this was an omnipresent, unmaterial being, all intelligence, right?
Well, certainly if we're thinking about Exodus chapter 3 and Moses' confrontation with the voice in the burning bush, the voice in the burning bush turns out not to be a thing or an entity or anything. It's a voice in the burning bush. It's this enormous, mysterious power that is transcendent in character, and we have attached the word God to that, but nobody thinks that the word God does it justice. Now, suppose out of the burning bush there stepped, this alien from Zeta 2 Reticuli, says, "Hi, Moses. You might have thought that there was something really big happening here, but frankly, we're just your friends from an off-Earth planet," and that would not have eliminated the religious sensibility of, hey, where did all of reality come from in the first place? Why is it that I have in my soul this attunement to what is infinite and beyond, and etc.? And so it only would have pushed the question of God back one step. Well, who made you the alien? Where did you come from? And isn't your world subject to the creation of the same God that our world is? So that's why I want to say I don't think that even if ancient astronaut theorists are correct that our ancestors had encounters with aliens, it doesn't change the God question.
Right. Well, I mean, I guess, you could say, hey, these aliens were able to create a hologram, were able to create an illusion. They could, send sound waves from a distance, so that's all you saw was this hologram of a burning bush.
Well, I love those imaginative scenarios, but it works. There's an assumption there, and the assumption is that our ancestors were stupid, that our ancestors couldn't tell a concrete manifestation from an experience with that which comes from the beyond or comes from the transcendent.
Right.
So
well, they did invent the wheel. So.
They did.
They did invent the wheel, so I think you're right to a degree. There's an intelligence there that shouldn't be undermined.
Yes. Oh, I'm happy with thinking that our ancient ancestors were intelligent, and as we said earlier in the show, I think they worked with religious sensibilities, which in part includes asking questions about the origin of all things, the meaning of all things, and the possibility that there is a divine mystery that is responsible for all these things. So those questions would be with us, with or without aliens, and I don't think aliens monkeying around with our genomes would really change that set of questions. So,
well, I'll stay on the fence on that one for sure.
Okay.
For now, until you come out with a Ted. But actually, we're going to wrap up here pretty soon. Ted, thank you so much for coming on the show. You're absolutely engaging. I love
talking with you. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, man. All right, so thanks again to Ted Peters, author of UFOs, God's Chariots, ? Check out his book on Amazon. You can also go to his website, tedstimelyytake.com. That's it for Epic Voyages on IRN, Inception Radio Network. If the spirit moves you, please follow Epic on Twitter at Epic Voyagers or on the Epic Voyagers YouTube page. And myself, again, on Instagram at ALANSNYC. Special thanks to Dr. Laura Blythe, Tag, and Ken Sherry from Epic, and of course our IRN producer Joe Champion. Everybody, good night, and let the mystery take you.
Thank you for being with us tonight. Please join us again next Monday evening for Extraordinary Phenomena Investigations Council's Epic Voyages. I'm Roger Peacock for Epic. Until next time.
You say too much to learn. You say cover up is fine. That your plan